Welcome to Funnel Reboot, the podcast that shares ideas on how to upgrade your lead generation. Here is your host, Glenn Schmeltzley.
Hey, Glenn here. Welcome to Funnel Reboot, the show where we share ways to upgrade the way that you generate leads. In the last episode, I talked with Nick Paprocki about how to do copywriting in a way that reaches all your prospects. I'd love it if you caught that episode, and if you want to catch all episodes, you can subscribe on pretty much any listening app, and that way you'll catch all shows past and present. Enough of that. Let's now get into today's show, which is about digital marketing during uncertain times. As you might know, once every few episodes, I like to do a solocast, and I'm doing this one in early 2020, so the topic of what's happening out in current events is clearly on my mind. It might be on your mind. And so I'm going to talk in generalities first about how we ourselves as humans react to crises. And at the end of this show, I'm going to talk about how marketers in very concrete ways can be reacting to what's happening around. I want to start with giving you a scenario. You're on a hike, and it lasts for several days. And at the end of the first day, you take a good look around and you memorize your bearings and the point on the horizon that you're going to walk to tomorrow. You go to bed. In the morning, you wake up, but your surroundings look nothing like what they did yesterday. You have no idea which direction to walk in. Well, the natural response is to ask, how come this is happening? Why is it happening to me? What did I do? Well, what if I told you in this scenario that you'd been hiking through a desert and that all that had happened was that the wind had shifted the dunes overnight? You wouldn't ask all of those navel-gazing questions, would you? You would just say, well, that's what you get for being in the desert. And I'm using that as a way to compare to current events and to set a context for how we need to look at what's happened, and we need to figure out how to get ourselves through the questioning process. And it wasn't fun, for example, when my parents would say, well, things just are just because they are. That's the way they are. And when I heard that when I was young, I didn't like it, but it's often the truth. Because we may learn why it happened, or we may not. But that doesn't change facts. And instead of endlessly dwelling on it, sometimes it's just best to kind of move on. And we have to recognize also that the truth is we don't notice many things that are changing in life all the time. We tend to fixate on just a few that do, and we arbitrarily call those things accidental. We don't notice near misses. We don't even notice when things go right sometimes, even though those were happy accidents. We tend to believe that we caused them, and sometimes we can also get lulled into thinking that things are meant to go right all the time. So when something does happen, we get this narrative that's playing in our head, and we try to say to ourselves, well, I had these plans for the upcoming quarter or the upcoming year or in the next few years. And we overlay that narrative onto the real world, really without any regard for statistically if it is going to happen. We always think it has a 99.9999% chance of happening. And then we do something even worse, and that is we tie emotions to it. So I'm reminded of a character from Charles Dickens in the book David Copperfield. Love this tragic character. His name was Mr. Micawber. And he went around, he never had any money. And he went around explaining how he felt. When someone would ask him how he was feeling, he would say, well, and he would assess kind of his life. He would say annual income, £20, annual expenditure, £19, 19 shillings and 6 pence. And the result, happiness. Annual income, 20 pounds. Annual expenditure, 20 pounds ought and 6. The result, misery. Basically, he was saying that if he was any money left over at the end of the year, automatically meant it was great. And if he was out money at the end of the year, he was miserable. Well, I mean, do our emotions have a basis in math? Or better yet, do we take our emotions and impose them on math? And I think that's actually what happens. And to show how I know this, I'm going to play a little word association with you. So I'm going to say the word future. You're probably thinking of the word, well, did hope come to mind? See, that's an emotional word. Hope, just like in Pandora's story, was the name for some boxed up piece of the future. And it's really just a label. It's not even a thing. It's not an outcome. It's just some generic thing we can attach to a picture, a vision, a shape, something that our mind can cling to in that hoped for future. But the reality is it doesn't work that way. The math of how events unfold doesn't have anything to do with how we wish and hope for things. If we're going to be mathematical, we need to acknowledge that the future that we had been walking around and pretending was going to happen, that it isn't going to materialize now. And it's probably best just to acknowledge that. It's a bit of a loss. And we need to make very sure that we don't just try to put it all back together. It's like the Humpty Dumpty story. We can't just use all the king's horses and all the king's men. That's an old thing called a sunk cost fallacy, that if I just put more time and effort into making it all back the way it was, that all will be well. No, this is like my story with hiking in the sand. The sands have shifted, and we need to take whatever route is the shortest to our destination now, not the one that we were originally planning to take us there before. And I urge us to do this because sometimes we can actually make things worse. There's a book called Tackling Complexity by Andrea Bassi, and he says in it, we tend to think that things are imposed onto us and that we need to just find solutions. But in fact, we're normally creating problems with our behaviors. I really believe in what he's saying there. I think that the common reason that we either think problems aren't solvable, or one of the reasons why problems are as hard as they are, is because we've put constraints on how we're going to solve it. We're going to say maybe there is a lot more that needs to be done to be able to get my department, my own business, my own work as a single employee on track, but I'm not going to work more than 37 and a half hours a week at that. Well, when we put a constraint on it like that, it's sometimes actually making the problem worse. If we just lifted that constraint, or we dismiss some kind of clear solution to that sticky problem, we're making it worse. Sometimes we could actually be doing ourselves in by doing that. Another thing that we're classic at doing is just avoiding the problem, sticking our head in the sand like an ostrich, and we don't absolutely clearly identify what problem we're trying to solve. We actually need to start there. We need to face the problem and call it out for what it is. I like the movie Apollo 13. I often think about the scene in it where Gene Kranz, played by Ed Harris, he gets all the NASA engineers together right after they learn about the crisis. They are working to help the astronauts, but all of the solutions that they've got have to support the 3 astronauts aboard. The capsule is only basically going to end up halfway back towards Earth. And so he draws this big orbit line, and he draws the spaceship approaching Earth, and he stops the line of chalk on the chalkboard where the engineers have figured it out to. About a foot away from that, he's got a big circle showing the Earth. And he puts his chalk on the Earth, and then he taps it on where the astronauts kind of can get to. Earth, astronauts, Earth, astronauts. And he just taps it, and he puts his chalk down. Then he leaves a big, long, pregnant pause in the air and faces the engineers. What he's done is he's stated the problem. And I believe that when you put words into reality of what you're confronting, you actually name it and you maybe say what has to be achieved for you to get through it, I think you're halfway towards solving it. Now, I'm going to go in a direction of explaining for a moment the way that people look at problems when they're confronted, how they model it. There's a very famous person who modeled it. Her name was Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And Dr. Kubler-Ross studied what happened to patients when they got life-threatening diagnoses. And she came up with a 5-step regimen that she noticed it was a pattern. Every patient followed, and there's a curve that these 5 stages fit on. The 5 stages that they get are, first, upon hearing a diagnosis, it's shock and denial, followed by anger, followed by bargaining, then depression, and then eventually acceptance. Okay, you say that's interesting, Glenn. What does this have to do with how you act in uncertain economic times? Well, you might think I'm being airy-fairy here, but most of the time I think that this is tied to how a hero's story works. Listen to me on this. So, when we go and read a book or watch a movie, we think about the hero's journey as just being some kind of upward climb and they're finishing on the top of a mountain. But actually, there's a lot of times when the hero's struggle isn't getting to new ground. It's actually just regaining old ground. If you don't believe me, you can hear some movies that I think classically illustrate this. Shawshank Redemption, Back to the Future, Taken, The Martian, Princess Bride, Gladiator, and if you let me include a trilogy, Lord of the Rings. So what do these all have in common? Well, movie scriptwriters will tell you that they're all based on a story arc called Man in a Hole. And so you're probably hearing now, and you'll see in the show notes when I put the 2 charts together, it follows the exact same line as the curve that Dr. Kubler-Ross had in her 5 stages. So again, you're going to ask me the question, so what does all of this have to do with how to deal in uncertain economic times? I think it's because we can't really act, and it's hard for us to think as people when we don't understand how we might fit inside of a larger plot. I've found that the realizations of how you do things in life actually only come once you grapple with past issues. Each of us is the central figure in our story, and we look for coherence in events that have taken place in the story so far. We have to look back on events that have happened, especially when they have changed radically, so that we can pinpoint our destination, and we can't do that without knowing what we might be leaving behind, or how we might face a loss, or how altering our course because we are accepting the new reality is actually a springboard for putting us into action. I don't think you can skip this step, or else you might actually find that you have a false sense of satisfaction. I think that once you acknowledge where you currently are, you can then maybe one day in the future look back on the actions that you took because of where you were. And those will actually bring you a vision of the entire arc that you followed. And that will be truly satisfying. And I think this is particularly important for us because we're creative people. And to be able to think creatively, we have to clear our mind from other distractions. I really liked what Craig Ferguson, the late night talk show host, said in his last show about what they had done. He said, there's now something here that didn't exist before. He was creating a body of work. It's hard to create things. Creating something out of nothing is actually so rare and so hard cognitively for us that a lot of people just don't do it. Birthing new ideas is hard. So to be able to birth new ideas in a trying time is great. And I would love to think that as we look back, whether you're hearing this in early 2020 or some other trying time, I want all of us to look back afterward and be proud of how we acted. And in a nutshell, we've got to get creating. So I'm going to move now to giving you a few concrete ways that you as a marketer can do this now. So as we think about how all of this uncertainty can be important for us as marketers, let's focus on what we might do as a response. And heads up, this is going to be kind of counterintuitive. The first thing I'm going to say is that we all have a tendency to make our planning horizon shorter. That's not what we're supposed to do right now. We're actually supposed to think long. We're making a trade-off actually in our heads when we do this. We're moving away from those signals of things that we think are important, like rushing onto social media, getting onto the bandwagon, and we're actually moving away from those instant gratification moves in exchange for things that don't have immediate payoff, but actually in the long term will make a difference. So one of the things I'd encourage you to do is, if you aren't regularly looking at your analytics, this is a good time to dive in, because it's user-friendly for us who even aren't math majors now to use these analytics tools. They can help us because by looking at data that's changing, even when it's changing a lot, there are still patterns. And this allows us to start asking in our head, why does the data look the way that it does? And when we start asking that question and we've got some ideas, we're going to actually be able to notice ways that we might react or ways that our companies should reposition themselves. So what I'm trying to say is that even though it seems like everything's changing, we might be able to find out how we need to react. Now, there are cases where in your industry, in your subvertical, in some of the client verticals that you serve, things really are fundamentally changing and you need to rethink where you fit. There are some great tools out there for doing this, some well-known models. I'd begin with the good old SWOT analysis: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. But you might even need to delve into some ones that look at the way that your company is positioned in a market and what your model is. And I would point you to the business model canvas, which was originally started by Alex Osterwalder, popularized by Ash Maurya. Another well-known model that looks at the forces that are happening in your company or maybe in your whole industry or maybe in the entire economy is Michael Porter's 5 forces model. And when you start to look at how this falls into individual client segments and markets, you could look at, for example, an Ansov model where it's a matrix that shows what markets you're in, what markets you could be in, what products you already have, what products categories you could be in. And what these are meant to do is just to help you see what's not changing. And when you're clear on how things have changed or not changed, you're able to maybe spin off some scenarios. And I'm going to put a link in the show notes to a company that has stood out in terms of the scenarios that it's been running. It's in an unlikely place. It's actually Shell Oil, and they began way back in the 1970s with reducing and first putting out all the ways that the future could be, and they looked out as far as 50 years. But when they superimposed these scenarios on each other, they found that there were certain things that occurred in every single scenario. And they actually came up with a name for it. They called it There Is No Alternative. And it's TINA for short. And when they noticed these TINA factors that seem to happen no matter what, the next question they had is, all right, how do we respond to that? And they would use 2 polar opposite responses that they would actually try to map out and show what they could be doing. What became very clear is whether or not it added value to that thing that was going to happen no matter what. I think that that's good in a time that things are shifting to be able to figure that out. But I'm also going to encourage us to look under our noses a bit, because while we might map out what value we could be doing in future, there's guaranteed things that we're not adding value on now, and it's time to cut those out. I think marketers are particularly well situated to point out value gaps in their organization. So what's a value gap? This could be anything from a dumb policy that you give, unnecessary hoops that sales has to follow and take prospects through, like that credit application that everybody hates, bogus charges that are put on invoices, bad instances of how you ding a client after they're finishing with you, just like a kick as they head out the door, unnecessary messages that clutter up their inbox, non-obvious ways to give feedback. And I just get incensed when I see these kind of value gaps. And I think at times like these, it's important that we realize companies can't get away with picking these arbitrary things to do to customers. It's like picking a fight. And when I'm a customer, I don't want to fight. I don't care what their internal processes are. I just want a good experience. And whatever their problems where they're not adding value to me, I want them fixed. And when you point out these disconnects between the money a company charges and the value received, you're going to win. If you don't, though, let me just leave this with you. This is the time when most customers are taking a closer look than ever at what they're paying vendors for. They're deciding if they scale back, switch vendors, or move what's being done in-house if it's a service. And they're doing this all through one lens, value. So let's imagine that you've kind of planned out how you're going to remove things that don't have value. You now have a plan for how you are going to deliver value. In your marketing function, I think it's time to actually test this plan. It's a little bit of a mix of we're moving into doing it and executing the plan, but we're actually not quite finished the planning stage. So I think this is best described when I talk about how people like astronauts work. If you look at the ways that astronauts do plan things, they actually notice what could go wrong. They run simulations. They spin out these simulations where the worst imaginable things happen. Chris Hadfield, if you get a chance, look at his book, An Astronaut's Guide to Life on Earth. He tells about times when he was terrified the first time that they would go through a scenario, but he would practice his response over and over again. And what happened was he just got less scared about it and he got more capable at it. And he then told when real disasters did hit, like a fire on the International Space Station, he was able to react calmly, and there was no question about what was done. You can even see this taken into the fictional realm with movies like The Martian that I mentioned, where Mark Watney, in fact, at the end of the movie, he explains exactly how he went through the entire movie. He said at some point, everything's going to go south on you, and you're going to say, this is it. This is how I end. Now you can either accept that or you can get to work. That's all it is. You just begin. You do the math. You solve one problem and you solve the next one and then the next. And if you solve enough problems, you get to come home. Now, these problems, or I'm just going to refer to them more as Murphy's Law, are things that crop up all the time in business. The interesting thing is that Murphy's Law is bound to happen, but Murphy's Law can also, in some cases, be foreseen. What we need to look at is our processes, and we look for ways where if Murphy's Law strikes, then we have to figure out, okay, well, would I be ready for that if it did? And if you're not, well, the good news is just copy and paste whatever that process is, make a slightly updated or a slightly varied sub-process for whenever that contingency happens. I'm a big fan of how everyone in the IT world works, where they version things. You just roll out a new version. You make it from 1.0 to 1.1. Once you keep doing that, you'll see that you can move quite quickly through scenarios. You can handle realities that seem to be things that your company wouldn't be able to handle at all. For example, if you follow if this scenario happens, then we will do that. Well, maybe in your standard 1.0 scenario, you say, well, we market to our prospects mainly at trade shows. Okay, now let's make a copy of that for version 1.1, which is if we can't see our prospects at trade shows, then we will interact with them digitally. It's up to you what you put there, but be agile about it, and you're doing a little bit of mixing, planning, and doing in the process. Now I'm going to talk about marketing communications, because this is also a very important place where you need to ask whether or not you need a new version. And it's a new version of the narrative or the point of view that you share with your audience. Because when times are tough, I notice companies crank up their content engines. But the issue is, like lemmings jumping off a cliff, most of them end up saying the same things. And bombarding buyers with all this sameness, it just causes them to tune out. This is what I think Mark Schaefer was getting at when he talked about content shock. Audiences are able to absorb massive amounts of content, but he was saying that it's actually when the content is just turning into like background static. That's the problem, is that people's brains tune out on that. So I would say, and I'm going to harken back to what I said about analytics, listen to the concerns that are on your audience's mind. Listen. And when you hear something that's calling on the unique perspective that your company has, or a unique way that you can help them, or maybe even a subtopic within their broader concerns that you know your company is an expert on, or the people in your company have a passion for, well, that's your unique view. Share that. And you won't come off as a me too. You will actually come off as a real thought leader. And there aren't that many of them, although there's many people that spew out content. And one of the things that I'm going to encourage marketers especially to do as they share this content, give ways for your audience to connect and directly get more of it. So this is where you're going to move away from third-party audience rentals. You're going to try to foster your first-party audiences. You're going to put them on a house list. You're going to have them interacting with your marketing automation tool. You're going to get to know their IP address. You're going to drop cookies directly on their site. You're going to have that one-to-one relationship. You're not going to use publishers or intermediaries. And this is something that I think can be a killer combo coming out of a tough time, because now they're listening to you, especially as they move towards a decision point in their buying process. You're going to be one of the ones that they're going to listen to, not all that background noise. Now, when you're talking with them, particularly in these times, be aware and be empathetic. They're obviously struggling with things in terms of their economic well-being, their company's long-term future. All the feelings I said at the beginning of this about how you are being affected, well, remember, they're being affected too. And there's no point in being hard and pushing them stressfully towards a sale. They'll buy in their own time. We know from psychology studies that the animal centers in our brains, that old lizard brain, is kicking into high gear, and that actually just blots out outside influencers. So we need to be slowly and from within, the thoughts that they're having, help them see how we can have a solution for their problem. We have to let them come to that decision in their own time. Our content is going to help them, but it's got to be of a helpful nature, and it's got to be coming from the problem that they're beginning with. I'm going to leave the last word to a gentleman who founded Mech Labs, Dr. Flint McLaughlin, and he's got a very passionate message for people in tough times, particularly for those of us in digital marketing. I'm going to link to a video that he's got where he explains that he sees us as having a gift, and that this gift has an inordinate amount of value in difficult times. He says that because we're so used to crafting messages, because we're so used to proposing how value is being given to a company that we sell to, this is actually a problem-solving framework that he describes. And he is a very good architect of how you solve problems with a value proposition, with an offer and a call to action. And it builds a bridge basically for people to understand how anybody around them can solve their problem with the help of that person. We're all here to solve problems. We can make a material difference, Dr. Flint says, in our own organization. He extends it to other departments in our organization by helping them reframe the problems that they have, trying to construct value proposition statements that explain how they might be able to get out of that problem. And he encourages us to even use this art that we have with charities, with community organizations, and other people who, right in that time of crisis, are wondering, how do they even fit in the new reality? I'm going to say that there's even a side benefit here, and that is when you do it for someone else, you're going to spot better ways that you can do this value proposition and message refinement for yourself. And so that's today's reboot. Is I'm going to encourage you to think of ways in the circles that you move in, how you might be able to help others with stuff that you take for granted. I bet that you're going to make a real difference. Well, I hope I've helped you in how you think about this. If you like what you've heard today, please feel free to subscribe on Apple Podcasts or any app that you have, or at Funnel Reboot. And if you really like what you heard, please share it with somebody else. I don't have any intent to sell anybody on anything here. I'm just sharing some helpful information, I hope. If there's somebody that you think would benefit from it, go ahead, hit a share button on your phone or copy a URL and let them know about it. That's how we spread to more people and show more people how to reboot their funnels. And if you want to give me any feedback on this, I'd love that. And you can get back to me on Twitter at Funnel Reboot or at HeyGlennS. That's all for today. Thanks very much for listening.
Thanks for listening. Follow the show on Twitter at Funnel Reboot. If you like what you have heard today, please consider leaving a review wherever you get your podcasts.